My name is Eleanor Barnes. I'm 63 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that love was something permanent, that if you gave enough of yourself, your time, your energy, your heart, it would root itself in the people you cherished and bloom there forever. I was wrong. I grew up with calluses on my hands and hope in my chest. My world was small, Barstow, California, a desert town where the wind carried dust more often than dreams. I met my husband, Terrence, when I was 19. He was tall, kind-eyed, with a laugh that made people lean in. We didn't have much, but we had each other. That was enough to build a life. We raised two children, Leo and Celeste. I poured everything I had into them. Every PB&J I packed, every fever I soothed. Every bedtime story I read, even when my feet ached after a day serving meals at the school cafeteria. I gave it all with love. Terrence worked construction, came home with dirt on his boots and love in his voice. Our life was humble, but it was ours. When Terrence died, just shy of our 30th wedding anniversary, something in me cracked. I remember lying awake that first night alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering how time had managed to steal my partner without even asking. But I kept going. Because Leo and Celeste needed me. Because I didn't know how to stop. Years passed. My knees began to ache more fiercely. My back stiffened when I bent down to tie my shoes. I told myself it was normal. Part of aging, but deep down I knew I was slowing. I tried not to let the kids see. I didn't want pity. I just wanted to be their mother. As I'd always been. Then one day I slipped. It was nothing dramatic. A carton of milk spilled. I reached too far. My foot slid on the tile and suddenly I was on the floor, gasping as pain shot through my ribs like a hot knife. I stayed there for what felt like hours, alone in my kitchen, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun above me like a slow, indifferent clock. Leo and Celeste came rushing to the hospital, all concern and urgency. But once the panic passed, their tone shifted. I could see it in the way they exchanged glances, in the silence that stretched too long after the doctor left. "We've been thinking, Mom," Leo said, fiddling with his phone. "You need more care than we can give. There's a place in Bakersfield, a good one." I remember blinking at them, trying to understand. "You're sending me away?" I asked. "It's not like that," Celeste said too quickly. "It's just you'll be safer there. And we have work. The kids, you'll get the attention you need." I nodded slowly. What else could I do? 2 weeks later, I stood on the porch of my home, suitcase in hand, as a van with tinted windows waited at the curb. The house behind me held decades of laughter, arguments, birthday cakes, and midnight cries. It was filled with echoes of a life built from love. And now I was walking away from it. Leo hugged me quickly. Celeste kissed my cheek. "You'll be happy there, Mom," she said. I wanted to believe her. I really did. Before I continue, I want to ask all of you to please give a like to this video and subscribe to my channel, The Silent Stories, for more stories like mine. Your support means the world to me. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment telling me which country you're tuning in from. It's incredible to see how far this community of wonderful people has grown, and I'm so grateful to be able to share my story with you. The van ride to Bakersfield was quiet, and I watched the desert roll by through smudged windows, wondering how something so wide and open could make me feel so trapped. The driver, a kind-faced man named Ray, tried making small talk, but I answered with polite nods and half smiles. I couldn't find the words to explain the ache growing inside me. Sunridge Valley Care Center stood tall at the edge of town, a beige stucco building surrounded by trimmed hedges and an artificial fountain that burbled without conviction. The place looked fine, not cold, not sterile, but not warm either. It smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and something I couldn't quite name. Loneliness, maybe. A nurse named Tasha greeted me with a clipboard and a tired smile. "We're so glad to have you here, Miss Barnes," she said. I didn't correct her. Nobody had called me Eleanor in a warm tone since Terrence passed. At Sunridge, I was someone to be monitored. An intake, a set of symptoms, a liability charted on paper. My room was on the second floor, halfway down a long corridor that echoed with shuffling feet and the occasional cough. It was clean, walls painted a pale blue, a twin bed tucked beside a nightstand, and a small dresser opposite a window that overlooked the parking lot. A plastic vase of fake daisies sat on the windowsill. I ran a finger across their dusty petals and thought, even the flowers here aren't real. Unpacking didn't take long. One suitcase, a few dresses, a photo of Terrence and me on our wedding day, he in a too big suit, me in a borrowed veil, both of us grinning like fools in love. I placed it gently on the nightstand right beside my pill organizer, past and present side by side. The first few days passed in a haze. Meals were served in a communal dining hall that smelled like reheated peas and instant gravy. I took my food quietly, sitting alone at a table near the back. Some of the other residents tried to smile or wave. I gave them the same nods and half smiles I'd given Ray. My heart wasn't open yet, not after what happened. Mornings started early, nurses clinking trays outside doors, aides wheeling residents to breakfast. Activities were posted on a corkboard near the elevator. Bingo, chair yoga, a Friday movie night. The kind of things designed to fill hours, not hearts. I went through the motions, ate, slept, showered, sat by the window and stared at the lot, watching families come and go, hoping to catch a glimpse of Leo's truck or Celeste's red scarf. They didn't come. One afternoon, I received a card in the mail. My name was typed, not handwritten. Inside was a short message. Hope you're settling in well. Sorry we've been busy. Love, Celeste. There was no photo, no call, just a card with generic flowers and empty words. I sat holding it in my lap for nearly 20 minutes before I tucked it in the drawer, not out of anger, but because the sight of it hurt too much. Nights were hardest. The silence crept in slowly, stretching long between the hours of 8 and 2 a.m., when sleep refused to come. I would lie in bed listening to the hum of the ceiling vent and the occasional creak of someone's walker in the hallway. My body ached in the quiet, but worse than the pain in my joints was the hollow in my chest. I began to question everything. Had I been too dependent? Had I leaned too hard on the memory of love, hoping it would be enough to hold my family together? I replayed every conversation from the last few months, trying to pinpoint where I went wrong. But the truth, bitter and sharp, was that I had been invisible for a long time, and I had refused to see it. I was a burden. That's what they believed. Maybe not in words, but in actions, and actions speak louder than any card or forced visit ever could. Then, on the 7th day, when I had nearly convinced myself to stop speaking unless spoken to, I heard a voice in the hallway. Who decorated this place? A prison warden with a Pinterest account. It was sharp, sarcastic, and followed by a laugh that crackled like warm firewood. I glanced out my door just in time to see a silver-haired woman in a leopard print robe rolling down the hall in her wheelchair like she owned the place. She stopped outside my room and looked in. Well, don't you look like a ghost at a tea party? I blinked. Excuse me? She smiled, eyes bright and unafraid. Name's Miriam. You've got the saddest aura on this floor. Lucky for you, I fix that sort of thing. She winked. See you at dinner, room 208. And just like that, something shifted. Not much, just a flicker. But sometimes a flicker is all it takes to start a fire. Miriam Carter was unlike anyone I had ever met, loud, unapologetic, and brimming with a kind of mischief that refused to age. She rolled into the dining hall that night like it was a red carpet event, her wheelchair decorated with string lights and a small plastic flamingo taped to the side. I was already seated in my usual corner, poking at a plate of lukewarm shepherd's pie, when she made a beeline for me. I told you I'd see you at dinner, she said, sliding up to my table uninvited. Room 208, right? Eleanor Barnes. Sounds like a novelist's name. You write tragic romances? I shook my head slowly. No, just a retired lunch lady. Miriam leaned in, conspiratorially. Same thing, if you ask me. Both jobs involve thankless labor and a lot of spilled tears. Despite myself, I laughed. It was short and surprised, the kind of sound I hadn't made in weeks. "There she is," Miriam said, triumphant. A pulse. I was beginning to think they moved in another ghost. From that moment on, she never let me sit alone again. Miriam lived 3 doors down in room 314, a space that looked nothing like mine. Her walls were covered in Polaroids and postcards from cities she'd visited in her youth. Paris, Buenos Aires, Kyoto. A lava lamp glowed lazily on her nightstand, casting soft swirls of blue and green across her bookshelf. And on her dresser sat a music box shaped like a carousel, which played an old tune I couldn't quite place. "Got it in Prague," she said when she caught me looking. "Bought it off a street vendor with hands like tree roots. Said it was cursed." I said, "Good, so am I." Her room pulsed with personality, defiant in the face of sameness. It was her rebellion against being forgotten, against becoming another sad story. She told me her life in pieces, never in order. 2 husbands, one she adored, the other she buried without tears. No children. Didn't want to pass on the crazy, she'd say, tapping her temple. Runs in the Carter line like arthritis. She'd worked as a cabaret pianist in Reno for years. "I've played for drunks, crooks, and drag queens in 5 states, she boasted. "And I miss every single one of 'em more than I miss my sister." Her stories were wild and probably half invented, but I didn't care. Sitting beside her, listening, laughing, something inside me began to thaw. We started eating every meal together. Breakfast was our favorite. Miriam would smuggle in tiny packets of cinnamon from the kitchen and sprinkle it into our oatmeal. "A little rebellion to start the day," she'd whisper, as if we were planning a heist. Over time, others began to join us. First was Mr. Delgado, a soft-spoken retired history teacher, who always wore cardigans no matter the weather. Then came Luan, a former nurse with a biting wit and a laugh like shattered glass. We became our own odd little family, table 6, always by the window, always laughing a bit too loudly. The staff took notice. Nurse Tasha once leaned over during lunch and said, "You all bring life to this place." Miriam winked. "We bring trouble, don't confuse the two." But it wasn't just trouble, it was healing. For all of us. I found myself opening up. I talked about Terrence, how he used to whistle old country songs while he cooked. How he once spent 2 days building me a porch swing, only to forget to hang it level. How his absence still ached like a bruise under my ribs. Miriam listened without judgment. She never offered cliches. Just her quiet presence, her sharp eyes, that missed nothing. "You know what I think," she said one night, as we watched the sun fade beyond the parking lot. "You didn't get sent away. You got sent here. There's a difference." I didn't answer right away. My throat was too tight. But deep down I knew she was right. One afternoon, she handed me a worn deck of playing cards. "Poker night," she said. "Winner gets bragging rights. Loser has to read a poem out loud." "I haven't read poetry in years," I said. She grinned. "Then you better not lose." I lost. And so, trembling and red-faced, I stood in the rec room that evening and read Mary Oliver's Wild Geese. My voice cracked on the second stanza, but I kept going. When I finished, the room was quiet, and then Miriam clapped. "Beautiful," she said simply. It was the first time in months I didn't feel invisible. By the time my second month at Sunridge arrived, something unexpected had happened. I stopped counting the days since Leo and Celeste last called. I stopped staring at the parking lot. I stopped waiting, not because I stopped loving them, but because I had begun, tentatively, quietly, to love myself again. Thanks to a woman in a leopard print robe, with too much eyeliner, and a heart big enough to hold me, when my own had collapsed. Something shifted after that poetry night. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it settled deep in my chest like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was simply surviving. I was beginning to live again. It started with the small things. One morning I found myself humming as I combed my hair. Just a few soft notes. An old lullaby I used to sing to Celeste when she was sick. I stopped, startled by the sound, then smiled faintly at my own reflection. The woman in the mirror still had grief behind her eyes. Yes, but also a flicker of light. At breakfast that day, Miriam noticed immediately. "You're glowing," she said, stirring her cinnamon oatmeal like a potion. "Either you found peace or someone finally fixed the vending machine." I laughed. A full laugh, not just a breath through my nose. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. We began organizing our own underground events at Sunridge, as Miriam called them. Nothing illegal, just a little outside the posted schedule. Game nights where the prizes were dollar store tiaras and old costume jewelry. Story circles where each person shared the most embarrassing thing they'd ever done. We once held a mock trial to determine whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Miriam defended it with dramatic flair. She lost, loudly. It didn't matter that our bodies were aging or that most of us carried regrets like scars. Around that table, we were not burdens. We were vibrant, whole human. One Thursday evening, Nurse Tasha wheeled in a karaoke machine someone had donated. "Who wants to go first?" she asked. Without hesitation, Miriam pointed at me. "Eleanor, obviously." My heart nearly stopped. Absolutely not. She rolled her eyes. "You've got a school teacher voice. You'll bring the house down." I shook my head, but the group chanted my name. Miriam leading the charge, and somehow I found myself holding the mic, staring at a glowing screen that said "Stand by me." My hands trembled, but as the music began, something strange happened. I remembered Terrence singing this to me, swaying in the kitchen as dinner burned on the stove. I remembered his off-key notes, the way he always messed up the bridge, so I sang, cracked and soft, but honest. By the time I finished, tears streaked down Luan's cheeks, and Miriam gave me a slow clap worthy of Carnegie Hall. "You've got pipes, Barnes," she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "Don't you dare die before the talent show." That night I didn't lie awake wondering if Leo would call. I didn't check my phone. I didn't even glance at the calendar. For once I was here, fully present in a life I hadn't chosen, but was beginning to love. Weeks passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. We celebrated birthdays with paper crowns and lopsided cupcakes. We held memorials for residents who passed, lighting candles and sharing their favorite songs. We learned each other's habits. Mr. Delgado always needed 2 sugars in his tea. Luan was secretly addicted to trashy romance novels. Miriam snuck extra dessert when no one was looking. And me, I started journaling again, just a few lines each night. What I noticed, what I felt, what I feared. I wrote about the people at table 6. About the way laughter echoed longer in a room that once felt empty. About how grief didn't disappear, but it softened, made room for joy. Miriam once peeked over my shoulder and teased, "If you're writing my biography, at least mention I was beautiful." "You still are," I replied without thinking. She paused. "You mean that?" "I do." She didn't answer, but her eyes turned glassy. I looked away to give her dignity, but I reached out and held her hand. By the time spring rolled into Bakersfield, with its cautious blossoms and dusty breezes, Sunridge didn't feel like a sentence anymore. It felt like shelter, not just from loneliness, but from judgment, from shame, from the weight of being unwanted. No, it wasn't the life I had dreamed of. Not when I was young, not even when I was dropped off at the front entrance. But it was something else. It was healing, and I was finally ready to accept it. Spring came and went. The orange trees just outside the facility bloomed early that year, filling the air with the soft scent of citrus and memory. On some mornings, I'd sit by the courtyard fountain, eyes closed, pretending I was back in Barstow Terrace in his lawn chair, the kids running barefoot in the dust, yelling over whose turn it was with the garden hose. In those moments, the wind almost carried their voices. Almost. Mother's Day arrived in early May. The activity staff put up paper flower garlands and arranged a tea social in the dining room. They handed out cards blank inside so residents could write something for themselves if their families didn't send one. It was kind in its own heartbreaking way. I watched the mail table that morning like I had every year, but unlike every year before, I didn't tell myself a lie. I didn't pretend the delay was from a delivery truck or a misprint in the address. I sat in the sunroom with a cooling cup of chamomile and accepted that there would be no call, no text, no card with shaky handwriting, and the words "Love you, Mom," because this time I was finally ready to admit the truth. My children had moved on, and not by accident. Celeste and Leo were not cruel. They didn't scream or slam doors when they dropped me off at Sunridge. They used soft voices, they kissed my cheek, they called it help. But help has hands that hold, not hands that let go. Their absence was not a mistake. It was a choice. One born from inconvenience and image and discomfort with what I had become, a body that slowed down, a woman who remembered too much of their past. I wasn't needed anymore. Worse, I had become a mirror they didn't want to look into. That Sunday afternoon, I skipped the tea social. Instead, I sat alone in my room, holding the old wooden jewelry box Terrence gave me on our 10th anniversary. It was scratched now, the clasp loose, but inside it still held the tiny ballerina and the faded receipt from the day we bought our first crib, a time when everything ahead still felt full of promise. I stared at the box for a long time, waiting for tears that never came. They didn't come because grief had made room for something else. Clarity. Miriam found me an hour later, sitting by the window. "You look like you've been having a staring contest with God," she said, plopping down beside me. "It's Mother's Day," I said simply. She nodded. "I know. My niece called me this morning. She's 6, thought I was her other grandma." I didn't correct her. We sat quietly for a bit. Then I said something I hadn't even realized was ready to come out. "I think I waited too long to let go." Miriam didn't answer right away. She reached over, placed her hand over mine. "You gave them the best of you, Elle. They just weren't ready for the cost of that gift." A lump rose in my throat. "They never even called." "That's on them," she said firmly. "Not on you." That night at dinner, the group at table 6 surprised me with a paper crown and a lopsided chocolate cake. Miriam had somehow convinced the kitchen staff to sneak it out before dessert rounds were officially served. "To Eleanor," she announced, lifting her glass of ginger ale, "our resident songbird table philosopher, and adopted matriarch." Everyone clapped. I laughed, brushing away tears I didn't even know had gathered. "You didn't have to do this," I whispered. "But we wanted to," Luan said softly. "You've given more kindness to this table than most people give in a lifetime." I looked around at their faces, creased, scarred, imperfect, real. These weren't people I had raised, but they had chosen to see me, to celebrate me, not out of obligation, but love. In that moment, I realized something monumental. Love given freely is love that stays. Later, alone in my room, I picked up my phone and scrolled to Leo's contact. My finger hovered over the call button, and then moved away. Not out of bitterness, not anymore, but because I no longer needed to beg to be seen. It began with a blank page, a sheet of stationery Miriam had given me months earlier, part of a floral printed set she'd insisted was too pretty to sit in a drawer. I'd kept it tucked away in my bedside table, untouched, waiting perhaps for a moment like this. The pen felt heavy in my hand. My joints had been stiffer lately, and the act of writing took more effort than it used to. But I welcomed the ache. It made the words feel earned. At the top I wrote, "To Leo and Celeste," and then I paused. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally knew what not to say. I didn't write to guilt them. There were no accusations, no angry pleas for why they didn't call, why they didn't visit, why I was left to sit in borrowed rooms watching other people's families fill in the silence. I had cried those tears already. I had screamed into my pillow, begged God for understanding. That pain had already done its damage. There was no reason to feed it. Instead, I wrote about the truth. I told them how I used to count the days between phone calls, how I used to rehearse conversations in my head just to keep their voices fresh, how I tried to defend their absence in front of others, saying things like, "They're just busy," or "They'll come next weekend." I admitted the shame I felt, the quiet heartbreak of watching other residents receive flowers and cards, while I sat with a silent phone and a smile I had to force. But I also told them about the people at table 6, about Miriam's sarcasm and Luan's wicked sense of humor, about Mr. Delgado and his poetry, about the talent show and the pineapple pizza trial. about how laughter had returned to my life in ways I hadn't thought possible. I described how it felt the first time someone here chose to sit beside me, not out of duty, but out of genuine care. I told them how I had stopped waiting, not because I stopped loving them, but because I started loving myself again. By the end, the letter had become something else, something softer, stronger, a goodbye not from this world, but from expectation, from the version of motherhood that said I had to be needed to matter. At the very bottom I wrote, "I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I won't carry this weight any longer." Then I signed it, just Mom. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. For a moment I considered addressing it, putting a stamp on it, dropping it into the facility's outgoing mail bin, but I didn't. Instead I walked out to the courtyard. The sun was setting, golden and soft, the sky streaked with lavender and pink, the kind of sunset that made you believe, just for a moment, that everything might be okay. Miriam was there, sitting with her headphones on, humming an old jazz tune. She looked up when she saw me. "You all right?" she asked. I held up the letter, wrote something I needed to write. She didn't ask to read it. She just nodded once, solemnly. I took a lighter from my sweater pocket, a tiny silver one Terrence had given me when we quit smoking together in '96, and touched the flame to the corner of the envelope. It caught slowly, curling at the edges, then blooming into orange. I watched as the paper disintegrated, letter by letter, truth by truth, into smoke and sky. When it was done, I exhaled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt light. That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I didn't look at my phone. I didn't reach for the old photos or replay old conversations in my head. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the stillness be a comfort, not a punishment. The letter had been for them, but the act of letting it go, that had been for me. The morning of my 64th birthday began like any other. The sun filtered gently through the slats of the blinds, dust floating in its golden beams. The hallway was quiet, save for the familiar click of nurses' shoes and the occasional squeak of a wheelchair. I sat up slowly, stretching my aching arms, thinking only of breakfast and whether Miriam would try to sneak cinnamon into the oatmeal again. I didn't expect anyone to remember. I certainly didn't expect anyone to celebrate. For years, birthdays had become just another square on the calendar, something to acknowledge with a whispered thank you and a polite smile. So when I opened my door and saw a small envelope taped to it, my breath caught in my throat. "To Eleanor, from room 314. Inside was a card hand-drawn, a lopsided cake, stick figure candles, and beneath it, in bold, messy writing, "You didn't get older, you got better, Miriam." I laughed. Then I cried. By the time I reached the dining hall, the surprises weren't over. Table 6 had been decorated with streamers made of folded newspaper. A plastic tiara sat on my usual seat, and someone had wheeled in a cassette player playing Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." There was cake, real cake, courtesy of Luan, who had somehow convinced the kitchen to use her grandmother's recipe. Even Mr. Delgado wore a birthday pen that said "Senior Sass." And then came the moment that truly undid me. Miriam stood and cleared her throat. "This place doesn't do a lot of celebrating," she began, adjusting her glasses. "So we decided to change that, because some people walk into your life when you least expect them, and make you feel found." She looked at me. Eleanor Barnes walked in here with sadness in her eyes, and silence on her shoulders, and somehow, without even realizing it, she gave the rest of us a reason to wake up with something to look forward to. I covered my mouth with my hand. Tears slid down my cheeks. "You are not forgotten," she said. "You're just finally seen." They stood, all of them, clapping, cheering, smiling. It wasn't a grand ballroom in Manhattan. It wasn't filled with elite guests and tailored suits. It was a beige cafeteria with flickering lights and mismatched chairs. But it was real. Every face was sincere, every voice full of warmth. In that moment, I understood something I had never dared to say out loud before. This was my family now, not bound by blood, but by choice, not obligated, but devoted in a way that only those who've known loneliness can be. Later that night, Miriam and I sat in the courtyard as the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky turned lavender, and the wind was cool against our cheeks. "Do you miss them?" she asked softly. I didn't need to ask who she meant. "I do," I said truthfully, "but I don't wait for them anymore." She nodded. offering me a ginger candy from her pocket. I took it with a small smile. You know, I added, I think being forgotten might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. Miriam raised an eyebrow. That's bleakly poetic. No, I said, shaking my head. It's just, I spent so long tying my worth to people who couldn't see me. And now, I'm surrounded by people who choose to. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The silence between us was full, not empty. As I went to bed that night, wearing the ridiculous plastic tiara they'd forced me to keep, I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't known in years. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't unwanted. I wasn't discarded. I was here. I was found. And I was finally blessedly loved.